No, because it is a crazy portrait, really. I mean, but I didn't want to put it like that. It's especially the sort of monstrous figure and the skull that, of course, caught our attention, and we had to wonder what could that possibly be.
Where the picture kind of bumps up against our preconceived notions of what a hall should look like, he might have other ideas for us. We don't know yet.
I'm Bart Cornelis, the curator of Dutch and Flemish paintings at the National Gallery, and also curator of this large monographic exhibition devoted to Frans Hals.
Well, we included Isaac Massa in the exhibition because it is, for starters, one of the best portraits by Frans Hals that we know, one of the most striking ones.
One of the things that we've often wondered about with this picture is his pose, where he's got his arms across his chest, which is a very peculiar pose, and it's often been said that it sort of prefigures the way maybe 19th century artists would have painted a person. So it was always seen as a peculiar pose to begin with. So we felt it was important to include portraits of Isaac Massa, partly because Isaac Massa clearly brought out the best in Frans Hals, this very relaxed sort of attitude in these portraits. We decided that we would love to have, you know, a whole wall, if you want, of portraits of Isaac Massa, the double portrait from the Rijksmuseum, the one from Chatsworth in that very peculiar pose with his arms across his chest, and another one where he sits backwards on a chair, which, by the way, is probably the first time an artist ever painted someone sitting backwards on a chair. Also because Isaac Massa was clearly a friend of Frans Hals. We know that because he was a witness to the baptism of one of Hals's children, and that's something you would likely give to someone you knew fairly well.
That also might explain his very casual pose, which if you know someone that well, you might go to that length to do that kind of thing, and take that liberty, really.
That in itself is really interesting when you see the same artist painting somebody over time in different ways.
While we were restoring the picture, it turned out that the background, you know, he sits in this oval, but the background to the portrait was actually overpainted. When the restorer had this hunch that there was something underneath the paint, we used infrared refractography to go behind the painting, as it were. There's one way of looking through the upper layers and see what is actually visible, what is there underneath the visible layers. And it turned out that there were indeed all sorts of things going on over the shoulder of this figure.
It's anyhow fascinating that you were able to sort of discern there was something underneath there.
Yes.
Before, you know, we even did any kind of technical photography.
Yeah, I mean there are some bits of impasto which relate to the lion or gargoyle head. These little elements here always kind of shone through, those pale patches. So there was something, some evidence of something being there.
You can see that there's two heads over his left shoulder, as well as a scroll coming down from his other shoulder, and a coat of arms. So that's the beauty of these techniques, that we could not only see those shapes, but we could even identify, in some cases, which colors they would have been through XRF imaging. But it's especially the sort of monstrous figure and the skull that, of course, caught our attention, and we had to wonder what could that possibly be. And it's interesting because it's bound up also with the identity of the sitter. It was often thought it was Isaac Massa, but not everyone was equally certain it was him. But these details actually helped us to identify him with certainty as Isaac Massa. Because what this is this monstrous figure over his shoulder. She's clearly a personification of envy. Envy is traditionally snakes for hair. And not only that, she holds, as we can see in other images that identify the pigment red, she holds a heart in front of her mouth. And that's exactly what envy does. It's essentially still exists in the English language when we say eat your heart out. Envy, jealousy. And then next to it, a skeleton. Now, what has that to do with Isaac Massa is the question.
He's a very interesting person. He was a grain merchant, very well-to-do grain merchant. He spent many years in Moscow.
Yeah, he was a broker with the imperial court, wasn't he? Really?
Yes,
Yeah.
and grain then as now was one of the largest exports from Russia.
A lot of what we know about Russia at the time comes from him, right?
Comes from him,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
he writes about the troubles, as the Russians refer to them in Russia.
And so that was Isaac Massa. Now there were quite a few other merchants active in Russia as well. And when we looked into his biography, it's quite clear that he had many detractors, people who thought that this young upstart was doing too well, essentially. And in fact, they went a bit further and they said that he was disingenuous and that his mixture of official business and trade was questionable. It's neither here nor there whether there's any truth in that. The thing is that those noises were made. Isaac Massa was obsessed with the idea that there were other people who were not happy with what he was doing in his sort of diplomatic role. Their jealousy is, as it were, personified in this portrait through the image of envy. And then there's a skull next to it, and then we have to look into that, because why would there be a skull next to envy? And the answer to that lies in an emblem book that shows how envy is being trampled by death in the shape of a skeleton. And that the caption to that emblem, which is exactly from the right period, and could have been known to Hals quite easily, it explains that only death overcomes all envy, essentially. So that's the message that Isaac Massa clearly wanted to send in this painting to his audience, that you can slander me all you like, because that's how he viewed it. But death will, in the end, put an end to it. It's a peculiar message to send in a portrait, really, because on the one hand you say, you can slander me all you like, I don't care, and yet on the other hand you take the effort, you make the effort to have all that portrayed in your portrait, all those elements there. You clearly do care. It's also interesting to note that the figure of envy is clearly after an engraving that would have been available to Frans Hals, an engraving by Goltzius. If you flip the engraving so that it's the other way around, you see a very clear connection with the figure of envy, even including the sort of wavy snake hair that comes from behind the skull. That's how the portrait would originally have looked. I don't know really any other examples of that particular sort of very specific iconography where a sitter clearly requests, because this wouldn't have been Frans Hals' own invention. This would have been something that the sitter would have requested. It's very peculiar iconography for a portrait. It was probably painted out quite early on, possibly after Isaac Massa's death in 1643. When his descendants may have thought, well, we don't particularly want to look at our father or grandfather in this particular circumstances, and we'd rather have just a portrait, and it was overpainted early on. So there was also no question that we would remove it. The paint that is used for the overpaint is indistinguishable really from any other 7th century paint. There's no reason to think that it wasn't applied early on, and so that's the fascinating story behind this portrait that we have, and that we, through these elements that we see in the background, can also be certain that we're looking at a portrait of Isaac Massa, which had been doubted by some.